Hot summer night, Mississippi, 1878. Sheriff Barley shoved his way through the saloon doors and paused. A thick fog of cheap cigar smoke lingered so heavily in the air, he could hardly make out any of the faces in the room. Drunken men talking over one another, a man pounding away on an out-of-tune honky-tonk piano, poker chips clanging against one another as players tossed them across tables. The soup of noise was just as thick as the smoke of fog in the room. Not unusual for a Friday night. Barley stood in the doorway and eyed the room, beads of sweat covering his face. With only a slight hesitation, he plowed through the wooden chairs, elbowing a card player and exposing the man's playing hand. The player turned, an angry sneer on his face. "Hey, why don't you?" Barley glared at the man until he hunched over and turned back to his game, like a dog trying not to be noticed, and mumbled something under his breath. Barley grunted and continued along his path, ignoring the groans of disapproval and condescending stares being hurled his way like social daggers. He swallowed past the lump in his throat and wiped his clammy palms down the front of his vest as he stumbled toward the bar. "Whiskey, quick!" The bartender walked over with a small glass and a bottle of Kentucky Red-Eye. "You all right, Sheriff? You look like you seen a ghost." Barley jerked his head from left to right like a pigeon, his gaze darting around the saloon before landing on the bartender again. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's nothing." He grabbed the offered drink with shaking hands, making the whiskey slosh violently in the half-filled glass. The bartender shrugged as he capped the bottle and started to turn toward the mirrored wall. "Leave the bottle, Jack." The man stopped mid-turn and eyed him for a moment before putting the bottle back on the bar. After another slight hesitation, he slowly walked away, leaving Barley to toss back his whiskey in one long gulp. The drink burned its way down his throat, but did little in the way of settling his nerves. He leveled his gaze on the mirrored wall in front of him, unable to look away as his reflection shimmered and was slowly replaced by that of the man he'd condemned. A noose necklaced around his neck. He jolted back, hopping off his seat and closing his eyes. He rubbed them hard before cracking his eyelids to peek at the reflection again. His own weathered features stared back at him, with dark smudges under his eyes and hollowed-out cheeks. He took a deep breath and sat back down on the stool. "I'll drink you out," he said in a low voice and grabbed the bottle of Kentucky Red-Eye, prying off the cork cap. "Yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll drink you out." He picked up the near-full bottle and tilted its neck toward his glass. Nothing came out. He narrowed his eyes and gave the bottle a couple of hard shakes, as if he were sprinkling salt on a steak. But the bottle continued to deny him its liquid painkiller. The faint sound of a harmonica began to filter through the typical din of the saloon, and Barley wiped beads of sweat off his brow. The view in front of him wavered around the edges. His grip on the bottle slackened, and it rolled out of his hand onto the bar. The unrestrained whiskey within started gushing out to pool on the scarred surface in front of him. He shut his eyes hard and slapped his cupped hands over his ears. No, you ain't real!" The bartender came over and lifted the bottle upright. "Hey, Sheriff, why don't you go home? Sleep it off." Barley opened one eye, then the other. Seeing only the bartender in front of him, he gripped the man's arm and nodded toward the bottle the bartender now held. "Jack, can you pour me a glass, please?" With compressed lips, Jack filled the glass and put the bottle back on the bar. "Thanks, Jack," Barley said as he gripped the glass tight and watched the man walk away. With a last glance at the bartender's retreating back, he brought the glass up to his mouth and jerked away at the feel of cool metal against his cheek. He looked at the glass. The whiskey was gone. In its place rattled a harmonica. Barley gasped and dropped the glass. The sound of it shattering silenced the room. He could feel everyone's stares. Jack came over and leaned in close, whispering, "Go home, Sheriff. Sleep it off." Barley's frantic gaze darted around the room. All eyes were fixated on him in deafening silence, as if waiting to see what their mad sheriff would do next. He pushed up from the stool. "Stop it!" he shouted. "Stop staring at me!" He stumbled his way across the room, bumping into tables and tripping over chairs as he made his way to the door and burst outside. Something was off. Way off. The normally hot Mississippi summer night was cold and crisp, like a Canadian winter's morning. Barley's breath misted when it hit the air. Looking around the vacant street, he rubbed his calloused hands up and down his arms, trying to bring some heat into the numb limbs. He turned back toward the saloon and stilled. The building was dark and empty, as if it had been abandoned long ago. Cobwebs were everywhere, even on the doors he had just gone through. Slowly he backed away and stumbled off the edge of the wooden planked sidewalk, falling to his knees on the dusty street. A street, normally bustling with people, was now cold and empty. Other than the howling wind, no other sound could be heard. Barley pushed himself to his feet and started running toward the jailhouse, the wind fast on his heels. A wind determined to void him of any hope. When Barley reached the jailhouse, he closed the door hard behind him and leaned his back against it, his breath sawing in and out of his lungs. His heart felt like it was trying to beat out of his chest. He shut his eyes tight. In the sanctity of his jailhouse, the still, quiet, peaceful air provided some solace. After a few minutes, his heart slowed and his breathing shallowed. His shoulders relaxed, and he took a calming breath before opening his eyes. The jailhouse's empty cell stood across from him. It slowly opened, its rusty, iron-barred door groaning on its hinges. Barley's breath hitched as he stared at the impossible sight. The harsh whisper of a man's voice haunted the empty air. "Barley." Barley scrambled out of the jailhouse, desperate to place distance between him and the disembodied voice. On the empty street, Barley shouted, "Help! Somebody help me, please!" He tried every door on every building. All of them seemed to have been locked. He shouted again, "Please! Somebody, anybody! Help!" He turned toward the sudden sound of a gathering crowd at the courthouse and ran toward the building to try the door. It swung open. Barley entered and rushed to each room, chasing the elusive sound of the crowd. But the courthouse seemed to be just as empty and abandoned as the saloon. When he got to the room where the trial had been held just a few days before, Barley paused for a moment. Behind him, the double doors slammed shut with a hard thud. Light flared as the gas lamps on the wall and in the chandelier came to life. Barley ran back to the large main doors and yanked hard. They didn't budge. He kicked at the doors and pulled hard on the doorknobs. Still, nothing happened. He even tried ramming the doors with a running start. The hard knock of a gavel being slammed against a block of wood startled him. Its echo was followed by a loud, "All rise! This court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Philip Stone presiding. All those who have business before this court come forward and you shall be heard." Barley turned to face the bench. Ghostly images of people who attended that cursed trial began to appear around the room. The judge, the jury, the prosecution, the defense, the accused, the crowd, and even a ghostly apparition of himself. The judge leaned on his elbows and said in a deep, raspy voice, "All right, let's get this trial underway. Prosecution, call your first witness." The chubby prosecutor stood and tucked his forefingers into the watch pockets of his vest. "Prosecution calls Sheriff Barley." Standing with his back pressed hard against the door, Barley watched his ghostly self get up and walk to the witness stand. The prosecutor joined him and asked, "Sheriff Barley, can you describe for us how you found little Sarah Matcliffe?" The sheriff pulled a toothpick from the corner of his mouth and said, "We found her body in the abandoned mill out on the edge of town. She'd been beaten, raped, and murdered." "And how do you know she'd been raped, Sheriff?" asked the prosecutor. "Her dress was bloody and torn upward. Plus, there was blood on her inner thighs and all around her private parts. Sarah was only 10 years old. That type of evidence only points to one conclusion." "Well, now you speak of evidence. What type of evidence told you Chin Down committed this horrible act?" asked the prosecutor, looking over at the defendant. The sheriff shifted in his seat. He stared angrily at the defendant and answered, "His harmonica. It was found under Sarah's body. Chin Down always kept it in the upper pocket of his coveralls. He never let that thing go. And there's only one way it could have gotten underneath Sarah's dead body." "And what way is that, Sheriff?" The sheriff looked back at the prosecutor, breathed deeply, and said, "Well, John, we figure it went down like this. Chin Down somehow lured her into the mill intending to rape her. There was a struggle and his harmonica fell out of his pocket and landed on the ground. After he raped her, he killed her and left her body right there on the cold, hard ground. Only he didn't know his harmonica had fallen out and that Sarah's body was on top of it. Now everyone knows Chin Down was sweet and friendly to little Sarah. We see now that he wanted more from her. And when he saw his chance, he took it." The sheriff straightened in his chair, then leaned on the railing in front of him and looked the prosecutor dead in the eyes before continuing in a stern, harsh tone. "Plus, he confessed to doing it." A smug look came across the prosecutor's face. "That's pretty compelling evidence, Sheriff." He looked over at the defense. "Your witness, Brandon." As the ghostly figures moved, Barley shouted, "No, no, no! Chin Down gave her his harmonica for her birthday. He's innocent!" Barley ran to the stand and turned toward the judge. "The confession, it ain't real. I coerced him into confessing." The ghost trial continued. Chin Down's attorney stood and walked toward the stand. His apparition passed through Barley and kept moving toward his ghostly self. "Hi, Sheriff," said the attorney. "Brandon," replied the sheriff. Brandon leaned on the railing of the witness stand and looked over at Chin Down. "You know my client is mute and can't even write his own name, right, Sheriff?" asked Brandon. The sheriff nodded. "Yep, everybody knows that." Brandon looked back at the sheriff and asked, "So if my client can't talk or write, how is it he gave you a confession?" "I told him what evidence we had and how I thought it went down. Afterwards, I asked him if that was how it was, and he nodded his head yes." "No, that ain't so!" Barley's panicked plea fell on deaf ears. "Then I wrote everything down and read it back to him. I told him that if that was how it was, then he could make his mark on the bottom of the page. And he did." Barley looked around the room and tried to address the court. "I told him he was innocent, and that by making his mark he'd be a free man." When no one seemed to hear him, he ran toward the bench. "You gotta hear me, Judge. I'm retiring soon and wanted a clean record. You know, no cases left open." He turned and addressed both attorneys. "Come on, fellas, help me out here. It ain't like Chin Down's any different than the others. He's a former slave. What does it matter?" The judge looked over at the jury and said, "All right, I think we've heard enough evidence. The jury is remanded to the jury room to render a verdict." The jury foreman stood. He looked at the other members of the jury, turned back to the judge and said, "No need, Your Honor. We've already decided." The judge clasped his hands and said, "Very well. How do you find the accused?" Barley slowly backed away. He couldn't pull his horrified gaze away from the jury as the foreman looked at the judge and said, "We find the accused." He turned and looked directly at Barley. His eyes were sunken in with dark circles underneath and high, gaunt cheekbones. His ghostly voice echoed like it would in an empty room. "Guilty." Barley gasped as something heavy and rough snaked around his neck. He tried grabbing at it, but the prickly, heavy feel of a rope tightening around his neck was unrelenting. Everyone in the courtroom turned his way, their gazes fixed on him, their faces twisted with disdain. Barley kept clawing at his neck, his eyes wide open, making a desperate plea. He gasped for air as the rope's heavy grip kept getting tighter and tighter. The judge leaned in and addressed him, the man's deep, raspy voice chilling. "Sheriff Barley." Still gasping, Barley looked into the judge's cold, dark eyes. Unable to speak, Barley's mouth motioned. "Help!" The judge continued, "It is the judgment of this court that you suffer the same fate as the innocent you condemned." The judge picked up his gavel. "This court is now adjourned." The gavel came down hard on his desk, and Barley found himself standing in the dark alone. The heavy weight around his neck vanished. He bent over, breathed heavily, and coughed. A loud crash broke the silence as the courtroom's double doors flew open, hitting the wall behind them. With a start, Barley staggered toward the exit, throwing glances over his shoulder as he went. When he got out into the street, the courtroom crowd had gathered at the gallows. On its platform were the ghostly images of Chin Down, the Padre, and himself. He ran over. "Stop! Stop!" he shouted, hoping to avoid his fate. He reached the top of the gallows platform and tried to grab the rope hanging around Chin Down's neck. Barley's hands went through the rope as if it were made of vapor. The Padre finished his prayer, while Barley continued to struggle to grip the rope. Barley then watched his ghostly self walk across the wooden platform with a lit cigar stub clenched between his teeth until he stood in front of Chin Down and said, "You got any last words?" The Padre leaned in and whispered loudly, "That's cool, Sheriff. You know he can't talk." The ghostly sheriff looked over and said, "You do your job, Padre. I'll do mine." Then he looked at Chin Down and asked, "Well?" Chin Down lowered his head. "I didn't think so," the sheriff said, forcing a brown burlap sack over Chin Down's head. "No, don't do this. He's innocent." Barley grasped at Chin Down, trying to hold on to the condemned man to keep him from falling through the trap floor. The Padre backed away. The sheriff backed away. The floor opened. The next morning, a woman's scream echoed near the center of town. Sheriff Barley's cold, lifeless body swung freely in the wind, the bright sunlight twinkling off a polished harmonica sticking out of his shirt pocket.